It began with a flash of light. At 12:40 a.m. on May 16, 2010, a brilliant explosion illuminated the front window of a duplex at 4054 Lillibridge Street on Detroit's east side. Inside, 7-year-old Aiyana Stanley-Jones lay sleeping on the living room couch, unaware that her life was about to end in the next few seconds. The flashbang grenade, designed to disorient, not to kill, shattered the quiet of the night. Detroit Police Department's Special Response Team members, clad in tactical gear and armed with MP5 submachine guns, prepared to storm the residence. A camera crew from A&E's reality show The First 48 stood poised outside, their lenses capturing the drama of the raid, though not what would happen inside. Officer Joseph Weekly led the entry team, his submachine gun at the ready. Within moments of the door being breached, a single gunshot rang out, and in that instant, everything changed. The night was unseasonably warm for mid-May in Detroit. In the upper unit of the duplex at 4054 Lillibridge Street, Chauncey Owens had settled in for the evening. Downstairs in the lower unit, Aiyana Stanley-Jones had fallen asleep on the living room couch while watching television. Her grandmother, Myrtilla Jones, was nearby. Neither of them knew that outside, in the darkness, members of the Detroit Police Department's Special Response Team were taking positions around their home. The officers had come for Chauncey Owens, the boyfriend of Aiyana's aunt, LaCrystal Sanders, who lived upstairs. Owens was wanted for the murder of 17-year-old Jereen Blake, who had been shot 2 days earlier outside a nearby liquor store. The police had tracked Owens to this address. What they didn't seem to fully account for was that the building was a duplex with 2 separate units and 2 separate families. Officer Joseph Weekly was the point man for the operation. A veteran of the Special Response Team, he was responsible for being the first through the door, carrying a ballistic shield in one hand and his MP5 submachine gun in the other. Behind Weekly, other officers waited, ready to secure the scene once entry had been made. Adding an unusual element to the raid was the presence of a camera crew from A&E's reality television show, The First 48, which follows homicide detectives during the critical first 48 hours of murder investigations. The crew had been riding along with the Detroit police, documenting their work for the popular series. Their cameras were rolling as the officers prepared to execute their high-risk warrant. At approximately 12:40 a.m., the signal was given. An officer hurled a flashbang grenade through the front window of the lower apartment, Aiyana's apartment. The device was designed to create a blinding flash and deafening sound to disorient anyone inside, giving officers a tactical advantage when breaching the residence. The flashbang crashed through the window and detonated near where Aiyana slept. The concussive blast and sudden light filled the small living room. Myrtilla Jones, startled awake by the explosion, saw her granddaughter on the couch. According to her later testimony, she believed the child had been set on fire by the grenade and reached for her. Within seconds of the grenade's detonation, Officer Weekly forced his way through the front door of the lower apartment. What happened next would become the subject of intense dispute, contradictory testimony, and years of legal battles. According to Weekly's account, as he entered the apartment, Myrtilla Jones slapped at his MP5, causing it to discharge. The bullet struck Aiyana in the head as she lay on the couch. Myrtilla Jones tells a different story. She insists she never touched Weekly's weapon, but was simply reaching for her granddaughter when the officer fired. "They blew my granddaughter's brains out," she would later say repeatedly during court proceedings, her voice breaking with grief and anger. "They came into my house, and they killed my granddaughter with a flashlight." In the chaotic moments that followed, Aiyana, bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound to her head, was scooped up by officers and rushed outside. Police radio crackled with urgent calls for emergency medical services. The 7-year-old was quickly transported to St. John Hospital, but the wound was fatal. Aiyana Stanley-Jones was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Meanwhile, at the scene, Myrtilla Jones was placed in handcuffs, arrested on suspicion of interfering with a police officer. She would be held for hours, tested for drugs and gunpowder residue, before being released the following morning. No charges would be filed against her. And in a bitter irony that would only fuel later outrage, Chauncey Owens, the actual target of the raid, was arrested without incident in the upstairs apartment. He surrendered peacefully, with no flashbangs, no gunfire, and no casualties. By dawn, news of the child's death had begun to spread through the community and into local media. As the sun rose over Detroit that Sunday morning, the stage was set for what would become one of the most controversial police shootings in the city's history, a tragedy that would extend far beyond Lillibridge Street to touch on issues of race, police tactics, accountability, and justice in America. The day after Aiyana's death, the Jones family home on Lillibridge Street became the focal point of community grief and anger. Stuffed animals, candles, and children's toys accumulated in a makeshift memorial outside the duplex. Neighbors, activists, and concerned citizens gathered for candlelight vigils, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames as they demanded answers and accountability. The Detroit Police Department's initial statements emphasized Officer Weekly's account that Myrtilla Jones had grabbed his gun, causing it to discharge accidentally. Police confiscated Aiyana's blanket, which showed burn marks from the flashbang grenade. But questions immediately arose about the tactics used in the raid, particularly the decision to deploy such an explosive device at night in a residence where children might reasonably be present. Ron Scott, spokesperson for the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality, devoted his radio program on May 16th to discussing the incident and organized a press conference outside the Jones home. The tensions between the police department and the citizenry are getting worse by the day, Scott told reporters, capturing a sentiment that was rapidly spreading through Detroit's African-American communities. The involvement of the A&E television crew added another layer of controversy to the already volatile situation. Critics questioned whether the presence of cameras had influenced the police to conduct the raid with more dramatic flair than standard protocol would dictate. The department denied these allegations, but the questions persisted. Recognizing the gravity of the situation and concerns about the Detroit Police Department's credibility within the community, the investigation was quickly transferred to the Michigan State Police. U.S. Representative John Conyers, whose district included Detroit, called on U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder to initiate a federal investigation, and the FBI subsequently became involved in reviewing the case. Meanwhile, Aiyana's family was living a nightmare. Dominica Stanley, Aiyana's mother, was consumed by grief. Charles Jones, her father, found himself not only mourning his daughter, but also facing scrutiny from police, who suspected him of involvement with Chauncey Owens and the Jerian Blake murder. Jones would later be convicted as an accomplice in that case, adding another tragic dimension to the story. On May 22, 2010, Aiyana's funeral was held at Second Ebenezer Church in Detroit. The 7-year-old's small white casket was flanked by flowers and photos of her smiling face. Civil rights leader Rever Al Sharpton delivered the eulogy, using the occasion to speak not only about Aiyana, but also about the larger issues her death represented. "This is not about blackness," Sharpton told the mourners. "This is about humanness." The funeral drew national media attention, placing Aiyana's death in the context of a growing concern about police use of force against African Americans. Though this was 3 years before the Black Lives Matter movement would formally emerge following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin, Aiyana's case would later be recognized as one of the catalysts that contributed to the movement's formation. As weeks turned into months, the investigations continued behind closed doors. The video footage captured by the A&E crew became a crucial piece of evidence, though it had not recorded the actual shooting inside the home. Adding another layer of complexity to the case, Allison Howard, a videographer associated with A&E, was later indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and perjury for allegedly lying about the video footage to prosecutors. In October 2011, more than a year after Aiyana's death, the investigations finally yielded results. A grand jury returned an indictment against Officer Joseph Weekly, charging him with involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment with a firearm. For Aiyana's family and many community members, the charges represented a first step toward justice. But the legal process was just beginning. The courtroom fell silent as the video played. Footage from the first 48. Camera crew showed Detroit police officers approaching the duplex on Lillibridge Street, the flashbang grenade exploding through the window, and the chaotic moments that followed. What it didn't show was the crucial moment inside when Officer Joseph Weekly's gun discharged, killing Aiyana Stanley-Jones. It was June 2013, more than 3 years after Aiyana's death, and Weekly's first criminal trial was underway in Wayne County Circuit Court. Judge Cynthia Gray Hathaway presided over the proceedings, which had drawn national media attention and packed the courtroom with family members, activists, and concerned citizens. Weekly, who had been placed on administrative duties following the shooting, sat stone-faced at the defense table as prosecutors laid out their case. They argued that the officer had been grossly negligent in his handling of his firearm during the raid, resulting in Aiyana's death. The defense countered that the shooting was a tragic accident caused by Myrtilla Jones' interference with Weekly's weapon, a claim Jones vehemently denied. When Myrtilla Jones took the stand, the emotional temperature in the courtroom rose dramatically. She recounted the events of that night, describing how she had been reaching for her granddaughter after the flashbang exploded, fearing the child had been set on fire. "They came to kill, and they killed a 7-year-old, she testified through tears. Judge Hathaway had to temporarily clear the courtroom to restore order. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury began deliberations on the charges of involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment with a firearm. Days passed without a verdict as the jurors struggled to reach consensus. Finally, Judge Hathaway declared a mistrial due to a hung jury on the charge of recklessly using a firearm. The more serious charge of involuntary manslaughter remained pending. Outside the courthouse, Aiyana's family expressed their disappointment but vowed to continue fighting for justice. The prosecutor's office immediately announced plans for a retrial. By September 2014, when the second trial began, the national conversation around police use of force had shifted dramatically. Just a month earlier, Michael Brown had been killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, sparking protests nationwide. Weekly's defense team had even argued against a delay in the retrial, expressing concerns that the extensive media coverage of Ferguson might bias the jury pool. The second trial largely mirrored the first, with prosecution and defense repeating their respective narratives of the events on Lillibridge Street. LaCrystal Sanders, Aiyana's aunt, who lived in the upstairs apartment, took the stand. Dominica Stanley, Aiyana's mother, testified as well, breaking down in tears during her testimony. Once again, Myrtilla Jones's testimony proved explosive. When asked to describe what happened after the flashbang came through the window, she became visibly distraught. "They blew my granddaughter's brains out," she said, her voice rising to a shout. "The Detroit police killed my granddaughter." The jury had to be removed from the courtroom as Jones continued her emotional outburst, a reflection of the raw grief and anger that still consumed the family years after Aiyana's death. A pivotal moment came on October 3, 2014, when Judge Hathaway granted a defense motion to dismiss the involuntary manslaughter charge against Weekly. In her ruling, Hathaway stated that the prosecution had failed to present sufficient evidence that Weekly had intentionally created a danger that led to Aiyana's death. This left only the misdemeanor charge of reckless discharge of a firearm for the jury to consider. A week later, on October 10th, the second trial also ended in a mistrial when the jury deadlocked on the remaining charge. Reports indicated that 7 jurors had favored acquittal, while 5 had voted to convict. The jury later stated that race did not play a role in their inability to reach a unanimous decision. For Aiyana's family, the second mistrial was devastating. They had endured more than 4 years of grief, investigations, and legal proceedings, only to see both trials end without resolution. The final chapter of the criminal case came on January 28, 2015, when Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy announced that her office would dismiss the last remaining charge against Officer Weekly. Citing 2 hung juries and the best interests of justice, Worthy described the outcome as unfortunate, but acknowledged the difficulty in proceeding further. Judge Hathaway, in dismissing the case, remarked that she was willing to be held responsible for the outcome if there was public criticism. "I have to follow the law," she said. "I'm not going to be afraid to make a decision because of public opinion." Outside the courthouse, as news of the dismissal spread, Aiyana's family expressed their anger and disbelief. The criminal justice process had run its course, but for them, justice remained elusive. In April 2015, as Detroit was still processing the dismissal of all criminal charges against Officer Joseph Weekley, the police department made a controversial decision. Weekley would return to active duty. Though his assignment was limited to a non-field capacity within the Criminal Investigations Bureau, the news ignited fresh outrage in the community. To many, it seemed inconceivable that an officer involved in the death of a child could return to police work, regardless of the outcome of the criminal trials. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit filed by Aiyana's family against Weekley and the Detroit Police Department continued to wind its way through the legal system. The lawsuit, initiated in 2010, had been delayed by the criminal proceedings, the city of Detroit's bankruptcy, and a separate federal civil rights action. The family's claims included gross negligence, assault and battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of Aiyana's civil rights through inadequate training and flawed police procedures. The civil case presented an alternative path to accountability, with a lower standard of proof than the beyond a reasonable doubt required in criminal proceedings. In civil court, the family needed only to prove their claims by a preponderance of the evidence, essentially that it was more likely than not that their allegations were true. A significant breakthrough came in January 2018 when the Michigan Court of Appeals issued a ruling that allowed the claim of gross negligence against Weekley to proceed. The court rejected Weekley's argument for governmental immunity, reasoning that a jury could potentially disbelieve his claim that the shooting was accidental. The court pointed to evidence such as children's toys visible in the home, which should have alerted officers to the likely presence of a child. For the family, this ruling represented hope after years of disappointment. While it did not guarantee a favorable outcome, it ensured that their claims would at least be heard in court. Outside the legal arena, Aiyana's death had become part of a larger narrative about police brutality and racial injustice in America. By 2015, the Black Lives Matter movement was in full swing, with protests across the country demanding accountability for police violence against Black Americans. Aiyana's name was often invoked alongside those of other victims, her story serving as a stark reminder of the human cost of aggressive police tactics. In community meetings, on social media, and at rallies, activists pointed to the raid on Lillibridge Street as a textbook example of what was wrong with American policing. Militarized tactics, lack of proper intelligence, minimal accountability, and a seeming disregard for the lives of Black residents in poor neighborhoods. Critics questioned why a flashbang grenade had been necessary for the apprehension of a suspect when children might be present. They asked why the raid had been conducted after midnight rather than during daylight hours, and they wondered whether the presence of television cameras had influenced the decision to use such dramatic tactics. The fact that Chauncey Owens, the actual target of the raid, had been arrested without incident in the upstairs apartment only added to the sense that Aiyana's death had been entirely preventable, a tragic result of overzealous policing rather than a necessary risk in the pursuit of a dangerous criminal. Nearly 9 years after Aiyana's death, in April 2019, the city of Detroit reached a settlement with her family for $8.25 million. Lawrence Garcia, Detroit's corporation counsel, stated that the settlement represented a fair resolution that balanced the needs of the family with the city's financial responsibilities. He expressed hope that it would provide some measure of closure for all involved. Jeffrey Feger, the attorney representing Aiyana's family, acknowledged the settlement while noting that it could not provide full justice for the loss of the 7-year-old girl. No amount of money, after all, could bring Aiyana back or erase the trauma experienced by her family and community. The settlement marked the end of the legal saga that had begun on that fateful night in 2010. But Aiyana's legacy continued to resonate. Her name remained a rallying cry for those seeking police reform and racial justice. Her story was taught in community workshops about police accountability and cited in academic papers about the militarization of law enforcement. In the years following the settlement, as America continued to grapple with high-profile police killings and the resulting protests, Aiyana's case stood as a reminder of how long the struggle for justice can be and how elusive true accountability often remains. Today, more than a decade after Aiyana Stanley-Jones was killed, her case continues to be cited in discussions about police reform, racial justice, and the value placed on Black lives in America. The settlement money has been distributed, the legal proceedings concluded, and Officer Weekly has continued his career with the Detroit Police Department. But the questions raised by Aiyana's death remain as urgent and unresolved as ever. What responsibility do police departments bear for the consequences of their tactical decisions? How can communities hold officers accountable when the criminal justice system fails to do so? And most fundamentally, how many more children like Aiyana will die before meaningful changes are made to the way policing is conducted in America's marginalized communities? The flash of light that illuminated Lillibridge Street in the early hours of May 16, 2010, was brief, lasting only seconds before darkness returned. But the light it cast on the deeper issues of American policing continues to burn, demanding attention and ultimately transformation. Aiyana would have been 18 years old now, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Instead, she remains forever 7. Her story a painful reminder of what was lost that night and what remains at stake in the ongoing struggle for justice. If Aiyana's story moved you, please consider liking and subscribing to this video. Some truths demand to be remembered. Justice requires witnesses,